Your throat is on fire. Your nose is running like a broken faucet. You drag yourself to the medicine cabinet, grab some ibuprofen, maybe a decongestant, and you're mostly functional by noon. Now imagine none of that exists. Not just the pills, all of it. No pharmacy 5 minutes away. No doctor you can call. No understanding of what a germ even is. Just you, a body that's failing, and a world full of plants and animals and other humans who've been watching carefully for a very long time. Here's what most people assume when they picture ancient humans dealing with sickness. Helplessness. They imagine our ancestors were basically us, just without the tools. Cavemen standing around going, "Man, I really wish I had penicillin right now," waiting for someone smart to eventually invent medicine so the suffering could stop. That's not how it worked. Not even close. Ancient people weren't dumb. They were incredibly observant, deeply practical, and they had something we sometimes underestimate: thousands of years of accumulated trial and error. Which honestly is a polite way of saying they ran an enormous, uncontrolled clinical trial on themselves and everyone they loved, and they kept meticulous mental notes. We actually have archaeological evidence of this. In Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, researchers found a Neanderthal burial site dating back 60,000 years. Buried alongside the body, pollen from 8 different plant species: groundsel, ephedra, grape hyacinth. Several of them have documented medicinal properties. Several are still used in traditional medicine today. A Neanderthal, not even a fully modern human, was being buried with what looks very much like a medicine kit. Let that sit for a second. 60,000 years ago, before agriculture, before writing, before any civilization you learned about in school, someone understood that certain plants do certain things to the body, and they cared enough about that knowledge to place it in a grave. That's not superstition. That's not luck. That's methodology. Slow, brutal, generational methodology, but methodology all the same. They looked at a world full of things that could kill them, and through observation, creativity, community, and an impressive willingness to try absolutely anything, they figured out how to not die. The real story of ancient medicine isn't a story about absence. It's a story about ingenuity operating under the most extreme possible pressure. And it turns out, when you push human beings hard enough for long enough, they get surprisingly good at figuring things out, even the things that sound completely insane. The pharmacy was always there. It just didn't have walls. Think about what a forest actually is to a body that's paying attention. There are roughly 400,000 plant species on Earth, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 28,000 of them have documented medicinal uses. Ancient humans didn't know that number, but they knew their patch of land the way you know your own kitchen. What's where, what does what you never touch without a reason. Willow bark is the one that gets me every time. People across ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient China, and indigenous cultures in the Americas were all chewing willow bark for pain and fever, independently, with no contact between them, separated by oceans and thousands of years. The active compound is salicin. Your body converts it to salicylic acid. Aspirin is acetylsalicylic acid, which means the thing you grab from the medicine cabinet for a headache is, chemically speaking, a very close cousin of what a person in ancient Mesopotamia was already reaching for. Nobody sent a memo. They just noticed it worked. That's the part that keeps stopping me. The convergence. They noticed which plant makes the stomach pain stop. They noticed which root causes a wound to close faster. They noticed that drinking from the river downstream of the dead animal is not ideal. And that knowledge didn't stay with one person. It moved, generation to generation, refined by every person who tried it and survived, quietly discarded when it didn't work often enough to keep. This is what researchers now call ethnobotany, the study of how human cultures have related to plants over time. And the further back you dig, the more the line between folk remedy and functional pharmacology dissolves completely. There's a plant called Artemisia. It's been used in Chinese medicine for over 2,000 years to treat fever. In 1972, a Chinese pharmacologist named Tu Youyou isolated the active compound artemisinin. It became the foundation of modern malaria treatment. She won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2015. The plant had been doing the work the whole time. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern that shows up over and over when you actually look. Ancient people stumbling onto something real, the mechanism invisible to them, but the effect completely legible. They were reading the results without being able to see the experiment. The experiment, of course, was running constantly, on everyone, all the time. Okay, now let's talk about something that kills people fast. You get a deep cut. No antibiotics, no sterile gauze, just an open wound in a world that is absolutely full of things that want to grow inside it. So what did they actually do? Honey, for one. Raw honey packed directly into a wound is not a folk superstition. It's a delivery mechanism for hydrogen peroxide, produced when glucose oxidase in the honey reacts with moisture from the wound. It creates a slow, sustained antibacterial environment. Ancient Egyptians were documenting this use over 3,000 years ago. The World Health Organization still lists honey as a legitimate wound treatment. The gap between ancient remedy and clinically validated intervention turns out to be basically zero on this one. Then there's spider webs, applied directly to a bleeding wound to help it close. This sounds like something you'd read on a sign at a Renaissance fair and immediately distrust. But spider silk contains vitamin K, which plays a documented role in blood clotting. Modern researchers have investigated spider silk as a biomaterial for sutures and wound closure, partly because it's stronger than steel by weight, and partly because the body doesn't reject it. Ancient people were pressing it onto cuts because they noticed it helped. They were right. And then, okay, breathe, maggots. Deliberately placing fly larvae on infected wounds to eat the dead tissue. This is called maggot debridement therapy, and it was used by indigenous cultures in Australia, by Mayan healers, by military surgeons in the Napoleonic Wars. It was largely abandoned when antibiotics arrived. Then antibiotic-resistant infections started becoming a serious problem, and suddenly maggot therapy was back, formally approved by the FDA in 2004 for treating wounds that won't respond to conventional treatment. If this is the kind of thing that gets you, drop a like, leave a comment. It genuinely helps. Anyway, here's the part that the universe seems to find funny. Ancient trepanation, surgeons working outdoors, using clean stone tools in open air, may have accidentally maintained better sterility conditions than 19th century European hospital surgeons who were operating indoors, wearing street clothes, moving directly from autopsies to deliveries without washing their hands. The germ theory of disease wasn't established until the 1860s. Ancient people didn't know why fresh air helped. They just noticed that it did, which is, again, the whole methodology. Watch, notice, remember, pass it on. A cut that would have killed someone who ignored it could be survived by someone who knew to reach for the honey. Someone drilled a hole in a living person's skull, on purpose, and the person survived. We know this because the bone grew back. That's the detail that stops you cold when you first encounter it. Archaeologists have found human skulls, hundreds of them, from sites across Europe, South America, and Africa, with neat circular holes cut into them, and around the edges of those holes, clear evidence of new bone growth. Bone regrowth takes weeks, sometimes months, which means whoever was on that stone table didn't just survive the procedure, they lived long enough afterward for their body to start healing the wound. This is trepanation. It's the oldest documented surgical procedure in human history, with examples stretching back at least 9,000 years. 9,000 years ago, someone looked at another person who was suffering, from a skull fracture maybe, or seizures, or crushing headaches, and decided that the correct response was to carefully remove a piece of their skull. Why? The honest answer is, we don't fully know, and we probably never will. The theories include relieving pressure after head trauma, treating severe migraines or epilepsy, and, almost certainly in at least some cases, spiritual reasons. The idea that opening the skull might release whatever was causing the suffering. All three explanations are plausible. None are mutually exclusive. Ancient medicine didn't draw a clean line between the physical and the spiritual the way we do, which is either a limitation or a feature depending on how you look at it. What's not in question is the technical competence involved. At a site in Ensisheim, France, researchers found a skull from roughly 7,000 years ago with 2 trepanation holes, one fully healed, one partially healed, meaning this individual survived at least one procedure, recovered, and then underwent a second one. The surgical approach showed clear signs of deliberate technique, scraping rather than cutting, which reduces the risk of puncturing the membrane beneath the bone. Someone had figured that out, through practice, on people. I find myself thinking about the person doing the procedure, not the patient, but the surgeon. What they knew, how they learned it, who taught them, how many attempts it took before the survival rate was good enough to keep trying. That knowledge lived in hands and in memory, passed from one person to the next across generations, in a world with no textbooks and no licensing boards. And it worked often enough that the practice spread across multiple continents independently. Which raises a question the bones can't answer. What happened to the ones it didn't work for? Here's where it gets harder to look at directly. There were things ancient medicine simply could not fix. An inflamed appendix, a complicated childbirth, a dental abscess that spreads to the jaw, then the bloodstream, then everywhere. These weren't rare edge cases, they were ordinary crises that happened to ordinary people with no path to survival, no matter how carefully they'd been watching the forest. Somewhere between 25 and 50% of children in ancient populations died before reaching adulthood. Let that number sit for a second. Not in a war, not in a famine, just childhood, the baseline. A coin flip, roughly, on whether a child born into even a relatively stable community would live to have children of their own. Childbirth itself was one of the leading causes of death for women across most of human history. A baby in the wrong position, a hemorrhage that wouldn't stop, an infection that set in afterward, any of these, without intervention, became a death sentence. Ancient midwives knew an enormous amount. They used ergot to stimulate contractions, repositioned babies manually, managed pain with herbal preparations. And still. This is the part that doesn't stay comfortable. Because those same conditions, appendicitis, obstructed labor, sepsis from a tooth, are still killing people today. Not in the ancient world. Now. In regions without reliable access to surgical facilities or antibiotics, a ruptured appendix is still frequently fatal. Maternal mortality in some parts of the world remains at rates that would have been recognizable to a healer in ancient Rome. The distance between what we have and what much of the world has access to is not historical. It's geographical. The ancient world's limitations were real, and they were brutal, and they were also, for a significant portion of the living human population, not entirely past tense. What ancient people did have, in ways we sometimes underestimate, was each other. The community functioned as a medical institution in ways that don't show up in the archaeological record because they leave no bones behind. Someone sat with the sick person through the night. Someone else took over the food gathering. Someone who had survived the same fever 3 winters ago told you what to expect and what to do. That accumulated social knowledge, who knows what, who survived what, who you go to when the child won't stop coughing, was itself a form of medicine. It didn't save everyone. Nothing did. But it meant you weren't facing any of it alone. And that, it turns out, matters more than we tend to give it credit for. Your body, right now, is running systems that were stress-tested for 2 million years before you were born. The immune system you're carrying didn't arrive fully formed. It was shaped, generation by brutal generation, by every pathogen that ever tried to kill one of your ancestors and failed. The ones who had a slightly better response to a particular bacterium survived to have children. The ones who didn't. Evolution doesn't send newsletters. It just quietly removes the people who can't handle what's currently going around, and the ones left standing pass on whatever helped them stand. This is what researchers now call inherited immunity debt, the accumulated biological memory of 10,000 generations of exposure. Ancient hunter-gatherers living in small, mobile groups had gut microbiomes of extraordinary diversity, shaped by constant contact with soil, water, animals, and fermented food they weren't even trying to make. Leave meat near a warm clay pot long enough, and something happens to it. People noticed it didn't make them sick. They kept doing it. Accidental probiotics, running continuously, for millennia before anyone had a word for bacteria. The placebo effect belongs in this conversation too, and not as a dismissal. It's documented neuroscience. When you believe a treatment will work, your brain releases measurable quantities of endorphins, dopamine, and in some cases, immune-activating compounds. The shaman performing a healing ritual over a sick member of the community was not simply performing theater. They were activating a real physiological response through expectation, social support, and focused attention. That's not nothing. In some studies, placebo interventions have produced pain relief comparable to low-dose opioids. Ancient healers didn't know the mechanism. The mechanism worked anyway. And then there's the thing that's hardest to quantify but probably mattered most: not being alone. Social isolation suppresses immune function. It raises cortisol. It disrupts sleep. It accelerates inflammatory processes in ways that are now well documented and genuinely alarming. Ancient humans were almost never isolated. They lived in tight, interdependent groups where illness immediately became a communal event. Someone brought food. Someone stayed close. Someone with scar tissue from the same disease sat nearby and said, without any medical training whatsoever, that they had made it through. That continuity of care, imperfect, unscientific, warm, was itself a treatment. Not a metaphor for one. An actual intervention with measurable effects on outcomes. The body, the plants, the community, the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 generations watching carefully and remembering what they saw. None of it was modern medicine. All of it was real. And now, back to you, sitting somewhere, probably fine, maybe a little congested, 5 minutes from a pharmacy. You are the unbroken end of that chain. Every single person who had to survive without what you have did. And here you are. Think about what that actually means, that unbroken chain. Not a metaphor, a literal, biological, uninterrupted sequence of human beings, stretching back through every ice age, every plague, every famine, every infected wound and difficult birth and mystery fever, all the way to the first person who looked like us. Every single one of them survived long enough to have a child. Every single one. The chain has no gaps. If it had one, just one, anywhere in your direct line, you don't exist. That is the thing that gets me every time I sit with it. They didn't have ibuprofen. They didn't have sterile gauze or germ theory or a number to call. What they had was attention, relentless, generational, collective attention to the world around them and to each other. They watched which plants did what. They kept the people who knew things alive as long as possible. They sat with the sick. They remembered what worked and quietly stopped doing what didn't. They were running an experiment with no control group, no ethics board, and no option to stop. And the results are sitting right where you are now. You woke up